Due to cartridge space limitations, old video games tended to be pretty light on dialogue. As a result, what little text was present had to be used effectively. That's especially true if you're a side character. At least the protagonist had the luxury of being on screen most of the time. The average RPG series got by while having roughly 4 to 8 playable characters, but Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem has a unique challenge in this regard because its playable cast contains 60 characters. That's already a massive cast to attempt developing, and that's before getting to villains, side characters, and world building. And so, what little dialogue each character gets has to be effective at conveying their personality and cementing their place in the world. This is done to varying degrees of success, as some characters don't speak at all, but when it's done well, I think it makes for a really impressive showcase of how you can write a compelling character, even with a small amount of screen time. This brings me to my favorite character, Jeorge. He's present in a grand total of 4 cutscenes, with his only other characterization being found in his endings. Despite this, I found him to be a really interesting character. You first meet Jeorge tucked away in a village outside the royal capital of Arcanea. He introduces himself as a sniper from the Arcanean army who escaped being captured by the Delunian Empire. He then says he wants to help Marth because he's aiding Princess Nina. Right off the bat, I think that's a cool and evocative setup. This is mostly my personal taste, but the idea of this guy breaking free from Imperial forces, then biding his time until he gets the chance to aid in the restoration of his homeland is it's cool, alright? I feel a bit silly going over this because it's practically RPG party composition 101, but having characters with diverse motivations strengthens the cast and world. Jeorge doesn't have a personal stake in Marth's story. The liberation of Altea and rescue of Princess Elise are irrelevant to him. What he cares about is Nina and the restoration of his homeland. It makes the world feel alive because, not everything revolves around Marth. He's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. This next part is admittedly a bit of a stretch, but I think it's cool, so I wanted to talk about it. Jeorge starts in the pre-promoted class Sniper, and I'm going to make the argument that by making Jeorge a sniper, the game is trying to imply something about his character. Looking at the other pre-promotes, they can generally be sorted into one of 3 categories. They're either seasoned warriors, high-status individuals, or, old. We know that Jeorge is an Arcanean soldier, but so is Tomas, an unpromoted archer who joins a chapter later. Why Jeorge but not Tomas? Continuing with the next chapter, Midia is the leader of her knight squad, so that's why she's promoted, so why is Jeorge? I think this serves to make Jeorge stick in the player's mind. If you're like me, you'll remember the random guy who, for some reason, was strong and experienced enough to be promoted. If they really wanted to drive this point home, they could have given him a base weapon level high enough to use Aparthia, but hey, who am I to speak on Kaga's design? We won't hear from Jeorge again in Book 1. What we do get though is his ending, where he becomes the captain of the Arcanean Bow Knights. Again, this seems like a pretty lofty position for someone who would lead you to believe that he's just a soldier. Titles like that aren't just granted to anyone. Jeorge won't show up again until Chapter 5 of Book 2, where we get this very, insightful exchange. With a little willingness to use your imagination, Taurus calling him Lord Jeorge and seeing that he has the Parthia can answer whatever questions you had about him. Lord is obviously a pretty important title, and the Parthia is one of Arcanea's 3 regalia weapons. What I'm getting at here is that he's part of the nobility. I like the way this is revealed. There's no big moment of realization, the game just lets you find out on your own. It's entirely possible that someone wouldn't pick up on the implication of Jeorge's status, and I like that the game respects its player base enough to allow that to happen. This next exchange, though, is one of my favorite scenes in the series, and the reason Jeorge is my favorite character. Lang? I hate that guy. What I love about this line is how much it shows about Jeorge's personality. Firstly, he refers to Lang by his name, not General Lang like Taurus does. In one word, it's conveyed that Jeorge doesn't respect Lang, which in turn shows where he stands in regards to the kingdom's recent behavior. I like to think that the ellipses followed by a question mark was meant to indicate that it took Jeorge a second to realize who the soldier was talking about, further reinforcing his irreverence towards Lang. The next part, I hate that guy, is also really good. Fire Emblem has a fair amount of Old English speak, so I hate that guy is comparatively pretty casual and flippant. It gives me the impression that Jeorge is laid back and doesn't take himself too seriously. The last few sentences just reinforce what the first 2 established, that Jeorge doesn't respect Lang and disagrees with how he treats civilians. We also see his patriotism that was established in Book 1 come back around, with him choosing not to defect to Marth's side for the sake of his men. Despite him only speaking 10 sentences in this exchange, we learn that Jeorge has no respect for tyrannical rulers like Lang and is willing to put himself at risk if it means following his moral compass. We'd see Jeorge again at the Casimir Bridge, where he's guarding the northwestern fort in order to stop Marth's army. Here, Gordon can talk with him and turn him to our side. Jeorge had actually taken Gordon on as a student between books, which is neat, I guess. So while Jeorge is loyal to Nina and Arcanea first and foremost, his disdain for Hardin's actions have pushed him to defect. I think this is meant to parallel Camus, a knight that was similarly loyal to Nina, but unlike Jeorge, could never bring himself to turn against his country until, you know. Also, what I was saying earlier about George's language characterizing him as a relatively casual person comes up again with him saying, "I can't stand Hardin." I'm well aware that this could just be a translation thing, but I like to think that this nuance was present in the original text. Unlike Book 1, Jeorge doesn't completely fall into the background after his recruitment. While reclaiming Altea, Jeorge can talk with the hero Astrum to recruit him. We get to see how Jeorge has grown and has realized that blind patriotism might not be the best idea. Honestly though, this exchange is more for Astrum than Jeorge, so I don't have much to say. I think it's cool how the user of the Parthia is recruiting the wielder of the Mercurius. I don't have anything profound to say here, I just think it's cool. You know, when you think about it, you could sort of see Jeorge, Astrum, and Camus as like a trio. Do you think it's meant to be like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms? They do that a couple more times in Fire Emblem. There's Uldigan, Quan, and Sigurd, Dimitri, Claude, and Edelgard, Sonic, Shadow, and Soul. Now we get his ending. After the war, he formed something called the Arcanea Free Knights and protected people from thieves. Various other characters even join him, being Astrum, Midia, Castor, and Gordon. Having the characters be linked in their endings implies that, even though it wasn't shown, they did grow close during the war. Again, with limited space, I struggle to imagine they could justify adding scenes showing Castor and Jeorge get close when the game is already bursting at the seams to fit in content necessary to convey the main plot. What was the point of this video again? Oh yeah, try not to be too quick to write off a story as shallow just because it doesn't seem to have much depth at a glance. It's not for everyone, but I always like stories that require you to read between the lines and really think about the content that's provided to get the most out of it. I think Jeorge is a good example of this kind of storytelling because he has a defined personality, an interesting place in the world, and a compelling storyline despite having so little screen time. Anyway, the next video is probably going to be about, I don't know, Klein, Inez, Leonardo, expected in 2026.